Welcome to So You Want to Start a Nonprofit. Again, my name is Kalita Lloyd, and I am so glad that you are journeying on experiencing and learning what it is to start a nonprofit, both legally as well as to being compliant, as well as to really create something that's going to be successful and impactful for the world. And so I'm glad that you have chosen to join me in learning more about this process. I have been able to develop a couple of different modules, and we are about to embark on the first module and the first session. And so, as we think about what is next on our journey, we want to start off with this first module, which I've entitled Legal and Tax. We're going to be able to go through this module in 4 different sessions around the legal and the tax work, being able to think about all the legal ramifications of thinking about a nonprofit, all the tax implications and what it means to be a nonprofit. And we're going to kind of go through that process. And so we're going to get started with our first session, nonprofit versus for-profit. So nonprofit versus for-profit. I want you to be able to understand what the difference is between a nonprofit and what the difference is between a for-profit organization, corporation, entity. And so we're going to be defining these by entities and how that looks. And so I'm going to break down nonprofits, I'm going to break down for-profits. And at the end, I really want you to know that you want to start a nonprofit, that without a shadow of doubt, this is something that you want to do. This is something that's been on your heart, and you know at least the dynamics of what type of entity to start with. And so the objectives for our first session is I want you to be able to understand again the difference between a nonprofit organization and a for-profit business. Now, let's be clear. I use the word organization for nonprofit and for-profit for businesses, but they are both businesses. And I'll make that clear through this session. They are both businesses. I want you to think of them as businesses. I want you to think about, though, is what is the difference between this concept of a nonprofit organization and the concept of a for-profit business. And so you'll be able to understand that through these objectives. Then I want you to be able to think about and know which entity is the best fit for you, for your great idea, this idea, solution that you have for the world. I want you to know which entity is truly the right one to enter into this world, right? Is it a nonprofit? Is it a for-profit? I really want you to be clear on that before you continue your journey So You Want to Start a Nonprofit. The third one is understand the concept and the purpose of the organization. And so I want you to be able to understand all these different concepts and truly the purpose of a nonprofit organization. I want you to know what a nonprofit organization is, what its purpose is, and really walk away knowing the entity that you are looking to start. All right. So what is a nonprofit? A nonprofit is a type of entity that operates for the purposes other than generating a profit. And so it might be like, duh, but knowing that a nonprofit is something that is not created to generate profit. Now, a nonprofit can generate profit. And so that's a misnomer that people think, okay, as a nonprofit, we can't make money. We can't charge for our services. Not the case at all. And actually, I'm going to encourage you to do so and develop a nonprofit that has the ability to charge for services or to create their own revenue. But to understand what the purpose of a nonprofit is, the purpose is not to generate profit. It's for the purpose other than generating profit. So you're meeting a need, you're meeting a charitable cause, and we'll go into the different categories, if you will, of what is considered a nonprofit and what the IRS considers tax exempt nonprofit. But a nonprofit organization is a type of entity that operates for the purposes other than generating a profit. So the purpose is not around profit generation at all. And so being able to just understand that, I think, is important in understanding a nonprofit. So the money generated from a nonprofit is reinvested in the mission of the organization. So a nonprofit organizations operate in various fields. Like I said, they can be charitable, They can be educational, they can be scientific, they can be religious, they can be humanitarian. All these different fields and areas a nonprofit can operate in. And so as a result, you want to really look at how is your nonprofit going to operate if you're choosing to start a nonprofit. When it does generate revenue, so the money that is generated through a nonprofit, whether you charge for your services or you are fundraising in different ways, that money all gets reinvested into the mission of the organization, which is going to differ from a for-profit organization or a business or entity when I talk about that. But everything gets put back into the mission and what it's created to do and for its purpose. Okay, and so what makes a nonprofit a nonprofit? A nonprofit is mission driven, right? It is formed to address a specific social, cultural, environmental need. Nonprofit activities are guided by their mission rather than their profit maximization, right? They are focused on what is this mission driven thing that we are trying to create in the world versus what is the maximum profit that we're trying to generate, right? Knowing that a nonprofit does need to generate revenue in order to sustain itself, right? It definitely has to do that, but that is not its purpose. That is not what drives it, right? It's very mission driven versus profit driven, right? Its tax exempt status makes a nonprofit, right? So once you obtain and maintain nonprofit, obtain and non, once you obtain and maintain nonprofit tax exempt status, you are exempt from paying revenue. So that can include taxes from the federal, the state, and the local levels. In addition, donations made to the nonprofit can be tax deductibles for donors. And so this tax exempt kind of shielding that a nonprofit has is what makes it a nonprofit. The revenue that it does derive, so whether it charges for its programming or services or any type of fundraising or money that it receives, it does not have to pay taxes on that, both federal and at the state and sometimes local levels. And so they're exempt from being taxed on that revenue. Very big deal, right? Then at the same time, those who donate, so donors and people who donate to a nonprofit, they also can receive a tax deductible donation for their donation as well. The third thing is a board of directors. A board of directors is also very specific to a nonprofit. Not other for-profit entities can have a board of directors, but a board of directors is very specific to a nonprofit and how it operates. And so nonprofits are governed by a board of directors or trustees. They're responsible for overseeing the organization's activities and ensuring it operates in accordance with its mission and legal requirements. And so the board of directors are really who are steering the ship of a nonprofit in its nonprofit requirements as well as its mission. It's the one that's really thinking and guiding and really is leading and making sure that the nonprofit is doing what it's supposed to be doing. The fourth thing is public accountability. Nonprofit organizations are accountable to the public as they often rely on donations and grants to fund their operations, right? They're required to disclose financial information and other relevant details to stakeholders, including donors, government agencies, and the general public. And so with this, they are accountable to the public, right? They have to disclose how much money they're receiving. They need to make sure that they're transparent with that. They also have to be accountable to the people who donate to them, right? It really has a public ownership with a nonprofit, in addition to who's governing it with the board of directors. So here's some examples of a nonprofits that you may or may not be familiar with. And some different nonprofits can cover different entities, if you will. So there's charities, there are educational institutions, there's religious organizations, there's advocacy groups, there's social welfare organizations. Foundations are nonprofits that can be tax exempt, healthcare organizations. And so you have Black Girls Code, which is a nonprofit. You have Partners in Health, which they more do healthcare work, but also they're a nonprofit organization and they have tax exempt status. So the revenue that they receive is not taxed. You have Teach for America, which many people know, and other educational institutions are nonprofit organizations. You have this religious organization, Compassion, and then you have foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? And so they are also different foundations that can be used. And then you have the ACLU that's very popular. Is considered a law firm, right? In a lot of different ways because it takes on legal cases, but it too is a nonprofit. This revenue is tax exempt. And then you have the YMCA, which the YMCA is another good example because the YMCA, you go to their gym perhaps, and you pay a membership fee to go in their gym. And we'll talk about those different aspects too. But they also are a nonprofit organization where their revenue is not taxed. And they have a board of directors and they have the ability. But all these organizations are not examples of nonprofit organizations. So what is a for-profit? Right? So a for-profit entity is also known as a for-profit organization or business, and its entity operates with the primary goal of generating profit, right? And they are generating profit not just for themselves as an organization or as a business, but it is for the purposes of their owners or their shareholders. So when we think about small business owners, or we talk about solo entrepreneurs, or anything of those entities, or we talk about corporations who are in the stock market and they have shareholders, these are the type of entities, and their goal is how do we generate a profit to benefit those people? How do we generate a profit to benefit the owners of the business? How do we generate a profit to benefit our shareholders if we're on the stock market and we have stock value, right? How do we generate profit to make sure that the people who invested, if you will, in our nonprofit, they are then benefiting, right? So the profit goes back into owners and shareholders for for-profit businesses. So their goal is solely to generate profit for the benefit of those people. So unlike a nonprofit organization, for-profit entities aim at maximizing their revenue and minimizing their costs, right? And this is so that in order for them to generate income for the individuals and the entities that own or invest in them. And so they are figuring out, how do we do things that increase our revenue, minimize our costs so that we can have a benefit to those that own it. Very much different from a nonprofit in that regard. And so what makes a for-profit a for-profit? One, you have ownership structure, right? So the ownership structure for a for-profit entity can be a privately owned person. So it can be an individual. I can own a business. You can own a business. You probably do, maybe. You can be owned by families. It can be publicly traded on stock. And so these are major corporations that are publicly traded. Those are different ownership structure, but they're privately owned, right? It can be a combination of individuals. It can be some multiple investors who own something. So it's usually rooted in private individuals and private entities or publicly traded stocks. That's the ownership structure of a for-profit entity. Very much different from a nonprofit. Then you have the decision making. For a for-profit organization, they make decisions based on maximizing the profit and increasing shareholder value, right? And owner value. They are figuring out, how do we cut costs? How do we increase revenue? That is how a for-profit entity thinks in order to really be successful in its endeavors. This may involve strategic decisions such as pricing or product development or marketing or resource allocation. Another one might be taxation, or is taxation. For-profit entities, they are subject to corporate tax, income tax, right? If they're a corporation in that sense. And they also have to pay federal taxes and sometimes local taxes and state taxes. And so part of what they have to do is they do have to pay tax on the revenue that they were derived, depending on what type of entity at what level, but they have to pay for taxes that they receive as a for-profit entity. And so they might have some capital gains on their for-profit investments, all those different assets. And depending on how the entity is set up, it might reflect on one's personal income taxes as well. But they are not shielded from income tax. Some other things to think about is a for-profit. What makes a for-profit is the investment and the financial aspects of it. For-profit entities can raise capital through various means, including issuing equity, so they can be selling their shares of stocks. They can borrow, so they can incur debt, and so they can borrow against their own company. They can borrow with loans or bonds against the business. Investors also provide capital in exchange for their ownership stakes, so they can get investors to invest with them in exchange for ownership. So their ability to receive revenue is different from how a for-profit does, right? They have the ability to issue different things to increase their investment and their financial well-being. Number 5, they're focused very much on stakeholders and their shareholders and their owners themselves, right? So their obligation is to other stakeholders, including their customers, their employees, their suppliers, and the communities in which they operate. And so they are very much looking at other people and how they are operating and what they should. I will say this might be one of them that can be received from a nonprofit's point of view, right? They should also have stakeholders as well. And so this would be one of those as well. Motivated by profit. For-profit organizations exist to make a profit, and this profit is typically distributed to shareholders, owners, or investors in the form of dividends and retained earnings. And so again, they're just motivated by profit in what they do. All right. And so just to really break down all the differences, when we think about a nonprofit or a for-profit, we are looking at how revenue is received, who owns it, and what their purpose is for. Nonprofits, you are receiving, as a nonprofit, you're receiving the surplus funds, so any funds that you have in your revenue and outside of what it takes to run the nonprofit and pay salaries and all those different things, that is reinvested into the mission and the objectives of the organization. Whereas for profit, all that extra money is distributed to owners and shareholders, right? Then ownership for nonprofits, it's public ownership, right? Because you are relying on public entities to give to your nonprofit. You're relying on donations from individuals, from foundations, from people, and you're receiving a benefit or giving a benefit as well. And so it's a public ownership of a nonprofit. Whereas for a for-profit, it may be an ownership of the owner themselves, or if it's selling stock, an example would be company shareholders, or if they're buying stock. And so their ownership is privately owned outside of that. Then the purpose for a nonprofit, again, is their purpose is to give service to others, right? But without the focus on revenue, right? And when I say focus very loosely, because you do as a nonprofit want to focus on how you're going to generate revenue. And we'll talk about that in some other modules, but that's not your prime purpose. And so I just want to make the distinction of what you should be thinking about still, right? It's not that you're not thinking about generating revenue, but your purpose is not to generate revenue to give to others. And whereas a for-profit, their purpose is to generate revenue, and it's very much focused with generating revenue because they have to exist to benefit their other stakeholders. And so just really thinking about those distinctions as you are looking at a nonprofit versus a for-profit entity. So these are some questions I want to leave with you as we wrap up this first session. is a nonprofit organization really the best thing for you in your big idea, the thing that you want to do? And so if you end this session and say, oh my gosh, I don't know if a nonprofit is for me, to me, that is a win, because now I hope you will take your big idea in a for-profit a for-profit direction, right? And so these are some of the statements that I just want you to think about. And there's others that you can probably think about as well. But if you find yourself saying, I am starting a nonprofit organization to make money, I want you to kind of slow down to that and say, is that really where I can make the most money? Because that is really not the purpose of a nonprofit organization. You might want to look into a for-profit business model for your idea, because that's where you're going to personally be able to make the most money and reap the benefit for your idea if it has that monetary value that would be render benefits to individuals more so than a public purpose, right? If you find yourself saying, I have this innovative idea that I think will impact X, Y, and Z population through a program or some type of research, then I'm loving that. I think you should go for a nonprofit, right? Like a nonprofit entity is exactly where that innovation and that idea of impacting a particular population with programming and research, things that can have a monetary value, right? But not necessarily one that is generating with that focus, if you will. So this innovative idea is around impacting like people's lives and changing people's lives through a program or research. And so that is more inclined to a nonprofit, and still could very much be a for-profit as well. So there's that. If you find yourself saying, people would pay me good money to do this, or to provide this, or to create this, then I want you to kind of step back and say, okay, if they will pay you good money, if you will, to do this work or what you're thinking of, then maybe a for-profit business entity is what's best for you, right? That might be something where you would reach more value and reach more people, and it will be more edifying to you if that is where your big idea was actually created, versus a nonprofit. So just think about that. And then if you find yourself saying, I don't want to have to charge for this program, service, or product, nonprofit may be the way to go. I'm not saying that everything should be free, because I do think there's a value in charging for things. But if your nonprofit idea is around helping single mothers do something really great where you know they don't have the income to, but you really want to provide this really innovative idea that would help change their lives, and you just need donations from other people and foundations and other funders to help support that, and that's how you're going to generate your revenue. And maybe you can also think of other revenue income bearing streams of income for the nonprofit, then a nonprofit may be the way to go. Just really thinking about, if you don't want to have to charge for this program, or in some ways you can't charge for it because of what it is, then a nonprofit may be the way to go in order to exercise that and be able to reap all the benefits of tax shielding, as well as being able to serve your community and be impactful. And so just to recap, I leave with you in this first session is, do you want to be a founder of a nonprofit? Do you want to be a founder of a nonprofit entity? And the definition of founder is a person who establishes an institution, a company, a society, etc. And so do you want to be that person? Do you want to be the person to bring something into the world that is impactful, that has a focus on its mission, has a focus on being impactful into the world? Is that where your big idea really gets to live? And so this concludes the first session of Module 1, and helping you to understand the difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit entity. I hope at the end of this session, you have clarity on a nonprofit is still something that you want to pursue, Or you still have questions of, well, maybe my idea might be better as a for-profit. To me, that's a win if that's the case. And those are the questions you're asking. So I look forward to seeing you in the next session, in session 2 of So You Want to Start a Nonprofit.